must throw on the dirt and pile on the dust, 'cause I'd do the same thing if I could. But you know what they say? They say it's all good. It's all good. Lord, it's all good. Big politicians are telling lies. My restaurant kitchen is all full of flies. Don't make a bit of difference. I don't see why it should. But it's all right, 'cause it's all good. Yeah, it's all good. It's all good. Wives leave their husbands and they begin to roam. They leave the party, but they never get home. And I wouldn't change it, even if I could. 'Cause you know what they say, man? It's all good. It's all good. It's all...
Homelessness in America is something we've gotten used to. Yet, if you lived in the 1950s or 60s or 70s, you'd rarely see a homeless person. But in 1982, President Ronald Reagan, influenced by psychiatrists who thought new medicines would stabilize the mentally ill if they were discharged to community mental health clinics, and by the high cost of maintaining state mental hospitals, which were often inhumane, reduced federal funding for state mental hospitals by 1/3, and thousands of mentally ill people were discharged into the streets. Some of the tax money saved by closing down mental institutions was issued to community mental health clinics to help house the mentally ill, provide treatment, and reconnect them to a better life.
You know, if they could.
This didn't work well, because most community mental health clinics were underfunded, thereby weakening America's effectiveness in helping people with mental illness.
Cry and the orphans plead.
Welcome to today.
Everywhere you look is more misery. Come along with me, babe. God, I wish you would. You know what I'm saying? I'm saying it's all good. It's all good.
While thousands of mentally ill Americans live in the street, the cost incurred by their suffering is not cheap. Sleeping under bridges or camping in a wet winter forest is not an easy life.
The world is damn you killed it. Get out. Alien scumbag. Beware you. I hate you. You're dead. You earned this. The world is damn you killed it. Get out. Alien scumbag. Beware you. I hate you. You're dead, creature. Stop. Die. Fly. The devil is coming. Get out, scumbag. Fly. You're dead, creep. I hate you.
Watch out! Save us! Help! Run!
Die, jerk. The devil is coming.
Living in isolation, eating poorly, seldom bathing, tormented by hallucinations, people get injured, sick, and more psychotic, beaten in body and in spirit. "26% of the homeless have severe mental illness. An estimated 131,000 veterans are homeless, and 45% of them are mentally ill." A visit to the emergency room, which is where most homeless people get medical care, costs a minimum of $500. If it's in an ambulance, add on another $400 to $500. If the injury or sickness requires a hospital stay, add on another $2,000 to $3,000 a day, plus physician cost and medical procedures. Who pays for it? We all do. When the homeless person gets out of the hospital, it is usually back to the street and the same brutal, destructive lifestyle. Scott Chambor, who works with problems of homelessness in Alaska, has a good story about a homeless man in Reno, Nevada.
So Malcolm Gladwell is a writer for The New Yorker, and he wrote an essay called $1 Million Murray. And the premise of the essay was that communities or we would be better off solving problems than simply managing them. And so he took that kind of premise and applied it to homelessness, specifically the chronic homeless. And he was able to interact with a couple of police officers and a hospital worker in Reno, Nevada. And they talked about their daily routine, and the police officers discussed their interactions with Murray Barr, who was a homeless chronic inebriate, who they said literally daily they would pick him up at somewhere in the downtown corridor, and depending on his condition, either deliver him to the detox or to the hospital, the emergency room. And so over time, they started thinking of, well, how much is this really costing us to manage Murray in this way, and it came up to be over $1 million. And so that's where the name $1 Million Murray came from. And so Malcolm Gladwell goes on to talk about how intervention or some sort of solution would be better off for not only Murray but for communities to actively seek those solutions.
There are $1 Million Murrays all over America. As an example, 7 frequent visitors to Bartlett Regional Hospital in Juneau, Alaska, who are homeless and have alcohol and/or mental health problems, each ran up hospital bills averaging $89,000 per year in 2011 and 2012. These are just hospital bills. They do not include other costs such as police intervention, ambulance fees, doctor's fees, court actions, prison time, nor the negative impact homelessness has on downtown businesses. There must be a smarter and more humane way to help these people and our society.
It's strange. When I first started hearing voices, I couldn't tell if they were outside of my peripheral, if it's something that someone else had just said, because sometimes the tenor of their voice sounded like what someone just said. I suffered a skull fracture in 2003 that was very violent, and it's strange to have both the diagnosis and the symptoms, because until the skull fracture, I was a pretty solid individual. I held down a job and I went to college, and I never wanted to dismiss my diagnosis as something like physical trauma to the head, but since that happened, I started doing strange things. I would black out, and I would hear people saying things that they actually didn't say, and it was a very confusing time for me. I mean, I started losing things slowly. My job, my college career, my friends.
Pam Watts is Executive Director of the Juneau Alliance for Mental Health, which houses and helps many people who suffer mental illness.
I think that understanding that for 50% of the population, mental illness will be a reality at some point in their life for them or their loved one. So recognizing that people who are experiencing mental illness want the same things that all the rest of us want is the first step in the right direction. One of those basic needs is having a place to live. The other thing, in terms of reducing costs and treating mental illness more effectively, is try to reach people before they end up in the correctional system. as many people know, the correctional system is the largest provider of mental health services in the United States, and something's wrong with that picture. Many, many years ago, people were locked up for mental illness, and we saw the need to move away from that. It was not considered humane. It was not considered effective. And our country's back in that mode of addressing mental illness, and we need to move away from it. There is effective treatment. Our collaboration with the medical field and with other supports in our communities, providing appropriate housing for people, and meeting other needs that are necessary for them to live successfully in their communities can be done, and that's where we need to put our energies.
The most difficulty we have in housing the mentally ill, two things: income and tolerance.
Dan Austin is general manager of St. Vincent de Paul in Juneau, Alaska.
Because mentally ill, like all disabled people in our society, and the low-income elderly as well, we generally do not have a sufficient income to meet the needs of housing, particularly in a community like Juneau. The other major challenge is being able to find an environment, a housing environment, where, particularly in multifamily housing, apartment living, where a person who suffers from mental illness is going to be able to expect some tolerance and inclusion within that community. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge. And interestingly enough, what we have found is that the housing environment that we have, the general population there, I would say, are probably more tolerant of people who suffer from mental illness than the outside population in general.
When people aren't a part of the community, they often isolate and become more disconnected from the rest of us. Isolation can be hard on anyone's mind, but if you have a mental illness, it can increase your psychotic thinking and feelings toward others. In recent years, the violent acts of armed, mentally ill people have usually been preceded by extended periods of isolation.
Mental illness, in a way, is a matter of losing perspective. It's a matter of losing the ability to relate to the rest of society, and so the isolation just makes it worse and worse.
I would say Maslow's hierarchy. If I have a roof over my head, clothing, and food, my stability is 45% better.
If you have to borrow money to build a building, and you have to meet that debt service every month, that mortgage payment every single month, that's going to become a big piece of your budget. And when you're operating a facility for housing, there's only one source of payments for those costs, and ultimately that's the tenant that you're housing in that building. So debt service is a big piece of it. In our town, in Alaska in general, energy is a big piece of it. Utility costs are a big piece of it. Insurance, maintenance. So we have spent our model for so many years now has been the typical government model, which is the lowest possible bid, right? Let's build the cheapest building we can and get as many units in it, because we don't have very much money to spend on this sort of activity. So let's get as much as we can for as little as we can spend. And so what we end up doing is we get units of housing that are very, very expensive to operate. And consequently, the amount of money needed for a tenant to live in that building is more than they can afford. And so then we go back to the government and we get annual operating subsidies or Section 8 vouchers or tenant assistance vouchers or whatever in order to make up for that gap. We believe that it is much more prudent to invest the money at the front end in the capital investment in buildings that operate super efficiently and with the lowest possible maintenance, and then deliver them debt-free. And then the incomes, the limited incomes of disabled people will meet those those rent costs, and you won't need tenant assistance programs, and you won't need the Section 8 program, and you won't need the government programs that add the expense of administration. We spend a tremendous amount of money just verifying people's income eligibility to live in designated low-income housing that's built by the government to a standard that is not cost efficient to operate. That's ridiculous. I know for a fact, because we've run the pro forma on this over the last 3 or 4 years, we can deliver an efficiency apartment of 383 square feet to market today for a cost of $500 a month. Now, a typical Social Security payment for a severely disabled adult in this society is about $900 to $1,000 a month. That makes a $500 a month efficiency apartment affordable to somebody without a Section 8 voucher, without tenant assistance subsidies.
Last summer, a contingent of folks from Juneau went and visited 2 Housing First permanent supportive housing facilities in Minnesota, one in Duluth and one in Minneapolis. And the interesting part was the comments that we received from the police department in Duluth, Minnesota. And Duluth has a very similar downtown corridor to Juneau. And it was constantly, there's a lot of concern about folks milling around the downtown shopping area. There was business concerns, there were safety concerns, and people were looking to the police department, the mayor, for ways to clean it up. The Housing and Behavioral Health Services organization that came together to develop the Housing First project went ahead and once it was created, part of the community dialogue was that the community felt unsure about this property because it was about 5 or 6 blocks away from that downtown corridor. And so they really wanted to make sure that the police department did more kind of runs past the safety checks on the facility and make that part of their routine. And speaking to a couple of the police officers in Duluth, well, they did that for about a week and a half when they realized that once the project got going and all the supports were available and people were housed, they didn't have to make those those extra calls around the facility because there was nothing going on. And so they were able to divert their attention elsewhere. The other kind of phenomenon that happened when they opened the project was the police department got a bunch of phone calls from concerned citizens asking, I normally see this guy every day on the corner, where I work, what happened to him? Or, oh my God, I think, somebody has put all the homeless on a bus and sent them out of town. Where are they? What happened to them? And so basically the police department was saying no, and they're at the project up the street and they're safe and fine. And so, the general impression is it really did clean up the streets in that downtown corridor. And I believe that it would probably have the same effect here in Juneau. Pocket Park, behind the bus substation downtown, I think you would see that sort of clear up because people will be housed, integrated in the community, and likely supported on what other needs that they have, whether it's physical health or mental health or substance abuse. The other cool aspect about being permanently housed and stably housed is the idea of peer pressure. When you have somebody who's kind of gotten into a Housing First unit, we were told this by the operators in Duluth, Minnesota, that the people who are in and likely starting to engage with friends who brought them into the homeless lifestyle or hanging out in downtown area drinking too much, other residents tend to say, hey, what are you doing? I see you were with Jimmy again today. You probably shouldn't hang out with him. You want to stay living here. And so we hear about that peer support and then peer pressure almost as another key aspect of making sure that people keep their housing.
We sometimes forget that this is a family, that humanity is not segregated into different parts, and that some of those parts have more value than another. in our particular society, one of our great failings, I think, is that we tend to think that people only have value if they work at jobs and pay taxes, and that leaves out a lot of people. That leaves all the children out. That leaves all the elderly people out. That leaves all the disabled people out that, for one reason or another, aren't working full time and paying taxes, and that's not true. It's everybody has value. So that's the problem, is just recognizing the value of every single human being, and the solution is love.
What can help me the most in life? Real friends. And by that I mean there are people in our community who are there to help people with mental illnesses, and they can be seen as artificial friends. They're there as a function. They're there as a job. A real friend is someone who does not put that illness before who I am. And that's powerful.
This film's title is Crazy, not because it deals with mental illness, but because the way we deal with mental illness and homelessness is crazy. We waste more money picking up the broken pieces of people's lives and putting a Band-Aid on them than we would if we addressed the problems earlier in a more focused, cost-effective, and caring way. If we did, it would be a win-win situation for everyone.